the circulation pushes around blood cells, and the blood cells have a molecule in them called hemoglobin. This is a picture of a red blood cell here, and going down to the molecule of hemoglobin, you'll see that there are 4 subunits to this hemoglobin. There are 2 alpha subunits and there are 2 beta subunits. And then they show here the binding pocket, which has the iron in it for each of these subunits. Now, hemoglobin is the protein that transports oxygen in the blood. Blood itself does not dissolve very much oxygen in terms of its ability and solubility. And so this molecule is absolutely essential for oxygen to be transported. And each of these allows for one oxygen to be bound to each of these 4 binding sites, of which iron is the central aspect of that. The red blood cells can carry the hemoglobin, and they carry them through the capillaries where the oxygen is then discharged. Now, carbon dioxide, on the other hand, will dissolve fairly well and is not necessarily bound to hemoglobin. It dissolves fairly well in the blood and is carried by natural solubility. The next system we want to look at is the nervous system. And this shows the development of the nervous system. And what you see is again, as organisms become more complex, their brains and nervous systems become more developed. And you can see over here at the bird level that you have very much larger cerebral hemispheres and much smaller optic lobes and olfactory lobes. Also, there's a relationship between the size of the certain different lobes and their function. So, for example, if an organism depends very much on its sense of smell, such as a frog or a lizard, then they have a fairly large olfactory lobe. On the other hand, if they depend on vision, like the frog here, and especially the bony fish, then their optic lobe is quite big. Now, the olfactory lobe is the lobe that, here it is in the lamprey, is the lobe that receives signals from the nerve fibers that are in the nose, and it processes the sense of smell. The optic lobe, the cerebrum, is the part of the brain that integrates all the intake from the various lobes. So it integrates the optic lobe intake, the olfactory lobe intake, the various other intakes of the body, and it coordinates the responses to these sensory signals. The optic lobe is the area of the brain that receives signals from the eyes and visual signals, and it processes the visual signals. So again, when you look at the brain of an individual organism, you can sometimes predict which of their senses is more important to their survival by how large that part of their brain is. The cerebellum, which is not present in some of these earlier forms and begins to become present here in the lizard and more in the bird, is responsible for controlling involuntary actions, but specifically refining motor movements. And what you see with the cerebellum is it gets larger in animals as they go from walking on 2 legs to walking on 4 legs to walking on, as we do, on 2 legs. The medulla oblongata, which is a swelling that's just above the beginning of the spinal cord, here, here, and here, is the part that controls vital function. And by vital function, I mean it controls our respirations, it keeps the breathing going on, it controls blood pressure and various important respiratory and vital functions. Then the spinal cord extends down below the medulla, and generally the skull is the dividing point between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. That is, when the brain or the nervous system exits the skull through the foramen magnum, then it is called the spinal cord at that point. It's a little bit narrower than the medulla oblongata, and it has a regular organization of spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves are those nerves that exit the spinal cord and go out and innervate various parts of the body. When speaking of reproduction, there are 3 types of reproduction. The first of these types is called oviparous. Oviparous organisms have an egg. This egg is fertilized. Sometimes it's internally fertilized. Frequently it's externally fertilized. Then this egg is laid outside the body and then hatched outside the body. So both the egg is hatched outside the body and laid outside the body. The ovoviviparous, which is the least common, is that the organism has an egg which develops inside the body and hatches inside the body, and then the young is produced outside the body. That's different than the viviparous, in which the organism never really is part of the egg. In other words, the egg is that single cell. Once it's fertilized, then there's no longer an egg. It's essentially a developing fetus. It then implants in a uterus inside the female, and this develops with the placenta. Now, I use the term placenta because the book uses the term placenta, but there's also something called marsupial, which we will talk about in the future, which is sort of a cross between an ovoviviparous and a viviparous, and it's considered viviparous. Now let's start talking about specific classes within the chordata. This is the most primitive class of organisms that belong to the chordata, but are part of the macroscopic world, and that is the agnathia. Gnathia means jaw, and ag means without, and these are the jawless fish, or the lampreys. These also have a life cycle called anadromous. Anadromous life cycle means that the creature hatches in fresh water, but then migrates to salt water to live, and then returns to fresh water to reproduce. Now, it is not just organisms like this that do that. You recall that salmon hatch in the fresh waters. They swim out to the ocean. They spend a considerable amount of their life cycle in the ocean, and then they swim back upstream to spawn, and then after that they die. Young lampreys are called amoebocetes, and these are their larval forms. Now, the lamprey, if you look at this picture on the right here, you see that it's essentially a single sucker-like apparatus. There's no jaw here, and it has this very nasty looking teeth here, and it attaches itself to a fish. It then scrapes and scrapes until it begins to suck blood out of the fish, and at that point the fish is, usually it detaches, the fish is weakened, but does not necessarily die, although many of them do die. The next class is called Chondrodicites, and that means cartilaginous fish. These fish do not have solid bone, but are made up of primarily cartilage. We will first go over the fin structure, as the book goes over the fin structure. Here is what's known as the pectoral fin. These fins are the fins that are closest to the head, and they are important for swimming. The next fin is called the caudal fin. These are back here, part of the tail. They are also important for swimming. Then there's the anterior and posterior dorsal fins. And this fin, and here's the second dorsal fin. This is the anterior fin and the posterior dorsal fin. These are on the dorsal side of the organism, so they're on the back, and they're used for stability. They're also used so that movie people can put these in the water so you can see them coming and have the Jaws music in the background. The anal fin is back here, as well as the pelvic fin. The anal fin is important for stability. The pelvic fin is also important for stability and also plays a role in reproduction in the male shark. There's also this area that runs along the side of the shark called the lateral line. The lateral line runs along this area, and it senses motion in the water, and it's what tells a shark that there's something injured or damaged in the water. And it also tells it that there are people in the water, because when people swim, their swimming activity is very similar to an injured fish. Now the osteothetes, is what's known as the bony fish, and it's different from the previous fish in that instead of cartilage, it has a bony skeleton. And the structure of this fish, and this is something you need to study for quizzes and tests, begins in this area. This is called the operculum. The operculum lies over the gills of the fish and protects the gills of the fish, so that water goes in through the mouth, and the fish is able to pump water through the mouth. And that's another difference between sharks and bony fish. Bony fish can pump water through the mouth and out through the operculum, so it goes through here and comes out here. Sharks cannot do that, and that's why they have to constantly swim in order to have the water run through their gills. But so here's the operculum, and within the body, in the digestive tract, is something called the pyloric cica, and I will show you that in the next diagram. This secretes digestive enzymes that help break down the food. Also within the bony fish, that's not in a shark, is an air bladder. Sharks do not have air bladders, which is another reason that they have to continually swim, because if they do not continually swim, they will sink to the bottom. Bony fish, on the other hand, can stop and sit still, and because of their opercula and their ability to pump water over their gills and their air bladder, they can float in the water and sit in the water motionless. Now here's the diagram I said I would show you some of those other features on. The stomach is here, and the cica comes in right in this area. Here's the pyloric cica, and it dumps its enzymes in at this level. Then you have an intestine, which waves through here, and then ultimately the waste goes out this way. Then you have this air bladder right here, fairly large gonad, where there's either sperm production in males or eggs in females. These fish also have a lateral line that sense motion. The brain is up in this area, the heart is in here, the gills are here. Now when a fish reproduces, the female laying eggs is said to be spawning. And so when they talk about the fish spawning, they're talking about the females laying eggs. Now this is a good time to go fishing, because the females do not eat while they're spawning. And once they come off of the spawning, they are ravenously hungry, and they will attack virtually anything that hits the water at that point. The eggs that they lay are called roe, and the sperm is called milt. And the males, after the females spawn and lay their eggs, or the roe, the male comes along and squirts sperm over top to fertilize those eggs. So obviously this is an oviparous organism. It's an organism that lays eggs, and those eggs are then hatched outside the body. Now here's the circulatory system for the fish. And if we start over here, well, let's start over here, since here's the heart of a fish has two chambers. It has a single atrium up here and a single ventricle down here. And blood enters in to the atrium from the sinus venosus, which takes in all the deoxygenated blood from the body of the fish, dumps it into the atrium. It's then pumped into the ventricle, and then that is pumped out the bulbus arteriosus, which leads out into the body. So the atrium is the area of the heart that receives blood from the circulation. The ventricle is the area of the heart that pumps blood out into the circulation. The fish does not have any means of controlling its temperature, and that's called an ectothermic organism. That is, it lacks the internal mechanisms to control heat. So if it's in cold water, it's cold. If it's in hot water, it's warm. And that's why their activity slows down when they get in cold water. Now here, this shows that once it's pumped out of the ventricle, it goes through the gills where gas exchange occurs. Then it heads out into the circulation to feed the body. Comes back deoxygenated, goes through the ventricle and goes through the circle again. This shows it another way. Here you have the dorsal artery here, the ventral vein here. It goes out, it's oxygenated, and then once it's pumped out and oxygenated, then it heads to the brain to feed the brain and then to the rest of the body.